My grandparents suddenly melted. These were the words spoken by a 4-year-old boy to his preschool teacher. And as the teacher began to piece together what had happened, a horrific family massacre started to unravel. The cunning killer had planted false leads. The motive seemed impossible to find. The identity of the murderer remained shrouded in mystery. But while the killer managed to deceive the police and everyone else, he was ultimately outsmarted by a 4-year-old child, whose observations exposed the one flaw in his otherwise nearly perfect plan. So what exactly happened that day? And how did this 4-year-old boy, step by step, help the police catch the real killer? The little boy in this case was named Johnny Hoffman. Since his mother was only 17 when she gave birth to him, Johnny had been raised by his grandparents, Jack Myers and Linda Myers. Although this couple was in a second marriage, and Johnny's biological mother was Linda's daughter from her previous marriage, meaning Jack wasn't actually blood-related to Johnny, this didn't diminish Jack's love for him one bit. Little Johnny wasn't just well-behaved and sweet, he was incredibly bright and clever. Wherever he went, laughter followed. Over the years, they had become each other's greatest source of joy. But when Johnny turned 4, a sudden tragedy brought this happy life to a devastating end. On March 27, 2003, around 5 a.m., Johnny was jolted awake by a muffled bang. Then he heard 2 more loud noises in quick succession. Not understanding what was happening, he prepared to get out of bed to investigate. But just then, through a crack in his door, he spotted a masked man walking toward his bedroom. Although Johnny didn't know the man's intentions, the sight of a masked intruder in his house in the middle of the night told him something was terribly wrong. He quickly scrambled back into bed, pulled the covers over himself, and pretended to be asleep. Little Johnny had once seen on TV that when a monster comes to your house, as long as kids stay asleep, they won't be in danger, and his quick thinking actually worked. The masked man who entered the room didn't immediately attack him, but he didn't leave right away either. Instead, he stood right next to the bed, watching, trying to determine if Johnny was really still asleep. In this kind of situation, forget a child. Even a grown adult would probably be shaking with fear. But 4-year-old Johnny showed remarkable composure beyond his years. Even though his heart was pounding, his face remained completely calm. The masked man stood there for what felt like forever, but he couldn't detect anything suspicious. So he chose not to strike and quietly slipped away instead. What the masked man didn't know was that no matter how smart Johnny was, he was still just a kid. The moment the man left, Johnny couldn't hold it together anymore. If the intruder had stayed just a few more minutes, he would have seen the boy trembling uncontrollably. Fortunately, the masked man's patience ran out, and Johnny narrowly escaped with his life. Perhaps out of lingering fear, Johnny waited a long time after the man left before carefully leaving his room. He then rushed to his grandparents' bedroom, seeking comfort. But what he saw was a horrifying scene he would never forget. His grandparents were lying motionless in bed. Each had a gruesome bullet wound. Their clothes, the walls, the bed, everything was stained red with blood. But because 4-year-old Johnny didn't fully understand the concept of death, seeing the blood slowly seeping from his grandparents' bodies and soaking into the bedding reminded him of ice melting. So he grabbed some towels, trying to stop them from melting any further. Of course, his efforts were futile. He thought about calling the police for help, but discovered the phone line had been cut. For a 4-year-old, besides family and police officers, the person he trusted most was his teacher. So wearing only his pajamas, Johnny ran all the way to his preschool, burst into his classroom, grabbed his teacher's hand tightly, and cried out, "My grandparents suddenly melted. Please, you have to help me." At first, hearing this bizarre statement, the teacher was completely confused. But the next second, her face filled with horror as she realized what must have happened. She immediately questioned Johnny about the details, and after learning everything, she rushed out and called 911. Upon receiving the report, police in Bradford, Ohio, immediately rushed to the crime scene. The medical examiner determined that the Myers couple had died between 4 and 6 a.m. The cause of death was being shot with an extremely powerful firearm. However, since no shell casings were found at the scene, police couldn't determine the exact type of weapon used. After a thorough investigation, the scene revealed no fingerprints left by the killer. Clearly, this person had been extremely careful, not only wearing gloves, but also cleaning up the scene afterward. The only clue was a set of size 40 footprints found in the backyard, but with just this evidence, solving the case seemed nearly impossible. So the police had to place their hopes on the only survivor, little Johnny. Initially, they didn't expect to get much information from a 4-year-old boy, but after Johnny described his narrow escape, everyone was amazed by his intelligence and composure, and they saw a glimmer of hope for cracking the case. Unfortunately, Since the killer wore a mask the entire time, Johnny couldn't see his face. He could only describe seeing a green monster, which indicated the killer was wearing green clothing. Beyond that, he had no memory of the killer's physical features. But here's where kids' thinking patterns get really interesting. Little Johnny couldn't remember basic physical characteristics like the killer's height or build, yet he could clearly recall the weapon the killer was carrying. Through Johnny's description, police were able to confirm that the killer had used a 12-gauge Winchester pump-action shotgun. However, even with Johnny's clues, the police still couldn't identify the killer. They had to proceed with conventional investigative methods, step by step. Based on the crime scene evidence, police initially believed this was a revenge killing committed by someone the victims knew. First, none of the valuables at the scene were missing, which meant the killer wasn't after money. Second, the fact that the murder weapon was such a powerful shotgun suggested the killer never intended to leave anyone alive from the start. This made revenge the most likely motive. Additionally, the front door showed no signs of forced entry. Instead, a small basement window had been broken into, and numerous messy footprints were found near this entry point. This meant the small window was the killer's point of entry, but this window was in a very hidden location, and it wasn't obvious where it led. Normally, if the killer were an outsider, it would make more sense to enter through a regular window or the front door, unless the killer was already very familiar with the house. Finally, the fact that both victims died in bed suggested they were still sleeping when attacked. Moreover, the distribution of the killer's footprints showed that after entering through the small window, he went directly to their bedroom. This indicated the killer's purpose was very clear and further confirmed that he must have been very familiar with the crime scene. So the police began focusing their investigation on who among the victims' acquaintances might have held a grudge against them. As the investigation deepened, neighbors, friends, and family members all mentioned the same name, Andrew Hoffman, Johnny's biological father. Since Andrew didn't want to take responsibility for Johnny's mother and refused to pay a single cent of child support, the Myers couple would angrily turn him away whenever he came to visit Johnny. Over time, the arguments grew more heated, and Andrew had made threats more than once, saying he would kill them. Police immediately brought him in for questioning, but after investigation, they discovered that on March 27, 2003, the day of the murders, Andrew wasn't even in Ohio. He was all the way in Kentucky. This meant he had no opportunity to commit the crime. Since the Myers couple lived simply and were easygoing people, aside from Andrew, police couldn't find anyone else who held a grudge against them. With no other leads, police shifted their approach and began looking for anyone who didn't have an alibi during the time of the murders, between 4 and 6 a.m. on March 27, 2003. After extensive screening, they actually found someone. His name was Greg Myers, and he was 25 years old. But when the Myers family heard this name, they felt the police were grasping at straws. That's because this man named Greg was none other than Jack's biological son, one of the victims. The father and son had always had a great relationship. When Jack remarried, Greg had even served as his father's best man. Greg also had no criminal history. Quiet and honest were how everyone described him. Plus, he had a key to his father's house. If Greg were the killer, he wouldn't need to go through the hassle of entering through a small window. More importantly, the footprints left at the scene were 2 sizes smaller than Greg's feet. The killer wore size 40 shoes, while Greg wore size 42. Therefore, police had to admit that Greg couldn't possibly be the killer. At the same time, they had run out of leads and were even preparing to file the case as unsolved, beginning to archive the materials. But just then, little Johnny provided another crucial clue. During one of the many interviews, he casually mentioned, "I heard him drive away to the right." Because Johnny was so frightened at the time and worried the person might come back, he had been carefully listening for the killer's movements. That's how he clearly heard the sound of the killer driving away and was able to determine which direction he went. At first glance, this information didn't seem particularly useful, but when officers familiar with the area heard this, they were able to narrow down the killer's general location. That's because the Myers couple's home was actually a farm in a fairly remote location. The direction Johnny described as "to the right" had only a few other farms nearby, no residential areas or businesses. This meant that if the killer drove to the right after committing the crime, he was very likely connected to one of those other farms. Police immediately conducted a thorough investigation of each one. They thought this time the killer would surely have nowhere to hide. Since the investigation scope had narrowed so much, it should have been simple. But after investigating everyone, they found that not a single person fit the profile. However, the police didn't come away completely empty-handed. In fact, they obtained an even more valuable clue. During the investigation, a local farmer told police that he had recently found a shotgun in the nearby river. After comparison, it was confirmed this was indeed the murder weapon used in the case. Police then realized the killer didn't drive to the right because he lived there. He went that way to find a deserted spot to dispose of the evidence. In legally purchased firearms, every gun has a unique serial number, so all they had to do was track down the serial number to easily identify the owner. But the police had underestimated just how cunning the killer was. Before discarding the weapon, he had scraped off the entire serial number. However, the killer had also underestimated the power of technology. Police found a laboratory that was able to restore the 8-digit serial number using an acidic solution. They recovered 5 digits, L3145. The remaining 3 digits couldn't be restored no matter what they tried. But even so, this clue was extremely important. At least now, police had another reasonable direction for the investigation. They began visiting various gun shops, asking about information regarding this weapon. Finally, with the help of one shop owner, they found an advertisement for a used gun for sale in a newspaper from several years ago. After comparison, they confirmed that the gun in the ad not only matched the model of the murder weapon, but the serial number also perfectly matched the 5 known digits. Without a doubt, this had to be the murder weapon. Police immediately tracked down the man who had sold the gun and learned the name of the person who had bought it from him. And this person was none other than Jack's son, Greg Myers, who had already been cleared as a suspect. But what puzzled everyone was, what could Greg's motive possibly be? According to family and neighbors, Greg had an excellent relationship with both his father and stepmother. They always greeted each other with hugs, laughed together at family dinners. To anyone watching, they were a loving family. So to uncover his motive, police conducted an extremely detailed investigation. And when the truth came to light, almost everyone was filled with rage, cursing him out in unison. According to the investigation, Greg had recently gotten hooked on drugs, which had created a serious financial crisis. Even the mortgage on his current house was about to default. If he didn't pay up soon, he would be evicted immediately. So he decided to kill his father, because once his father died, he would become the sole heir to the farm. That was his motive for murder. But what truly enraged people wasn't just the act of killing his father for money. It was the fact that before all this, Greg had never asked anyone for a loan. You could maybe understand being too embarrassed to borrow from co-workers or friends, but borrowing from your parents, he still didn't do it. His parents didn't even know he was in trouble. This meant that when Greg faced his financial crisis, his first instinct wasn't to ask for help. It was to just kill his father outright. Keep in mind, his father owned a pizza shop and was fully capable of helping him financially. But Greg didn't go to his father for a loan. Instead, he wanted to get all of his father's assets in one fell swoop. This shows just how callously he disregarded human life, cold-blooded to the core. Perhaps until the moment of his death, Greg's father thought he must be mistaken, unable to believe he was being killed by his own son, someone he'd always gotten along with so well. It's impossible to imagine the depth of grief and despair he must have felt in those final moments. Many of the officers who were also parents were absolutely furious. They channeled that anger into determination and worked through the night to bring Greg in for questioning. But when faced with interrogation, Greg acted like an outsider to the whole thing, maintaining a completely detached demeanor throughout. He refused to admit to the murders. With just one statement, "My gun was lost before the murder," he nearly shut down the entire investigation. After all, there were no fingerprints on the murder weapon. From a legal standpoint, there was no way to prove he was the killer, but the police weren't about to let this monster go free. Every officer in the Bradford Police Department was determined to bring him to justice. They returned to the river where the murder weapon had been found, hoping to discover more evidence. After 5 days and nights of searching, they found a black plastic bag downstream. Inside were a pair of latex gloves, a green hunting coverall, and a pair of size 40 sneakers. Combined with little Johnny's testimony, they could confirm these were definitely the items the killer had used during the crime. Normally, after evidence has been submerged in water for nearly a month, extracting fingerprints would be virtually impossible. If that were the case, they naturally couldn't prove these items belonged to Greg, and they couldn't convict him. But what the police never expected was that the forensics team actually managed to extract fingerprint information from the inside of the gloves. Here's what happened. Before putting on the gloves, Greg had run his fingers through his hair. This caused his fingers to pick up hair gel oil, which left fingerprints inside the gloves that weren't completely washed away by the river water. This ultimately became the key evidence that convicted him. On April 27, 2004, Greg Myers was found guilty of double homicide and sentenced to life in prison.